I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk
scripture.
about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had invited.
Remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. Today, Jay Medenwaldt joins us as we wonder what sort of a tool is the Enneagram. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is still Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. Our legal disclaimer, our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Jay Medenwaldt, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the Webcast. Although we probably will not mention it again, this satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements. Notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too if you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else. To ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. Never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant, and don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Yes, indeed.
That is
Greetings,
correct.
Jay. Well, here's our applause section where Choo Choo can actually get a live audience.
Yes,
So,
we do appreciate you joining us today for our. We will have some serious discussion, but we do have our antics as well, and we have to kind of keep up our mythology that we are satire laden apologists. Yeah,
yes,
that's
right,
sweet.
right.
Uh, and I've been thinking we need to create a new profiling test. We'll call it the foodogram, maybe, where someone can determine their best path back to the realization that they're not sinners based on their dietary preferences. How do you like that?
I like that. I think we should just have something called the Enneagram, the ANY-agram. It's like any gram you want, any kind of.
Enneagram you want.
Right, right.
A
So,
self identifying, well, this is a self validating tool. And I actually met up with Jay Medenwaldt a couple of years ago now, prior to writing our book, because he had done. In fact, I can show this to you. I believe I can show this to you. Of course, I believe a lot of things
you
because I am.
believe, I believe.
If I am nothing else, I am gullible.
Mhm.
Um, but we have his article by Jay Medenwaldt, and you can get that at jmedenwaldt.com. It's Psych, Science, Apologetics, and Theology, the Enneagram, Science, and Christianity, Part 1. And as it happens, he also has Part 2 there. And in here, he admits that he was unaware of the Enneagram in 2017. He says, despite my embarrassment, I swallowed my pride and sought to learn more about it. Now, one of the things he says in here, which I find a little bit interesting,
A little bit.
so I don't remove him, is there we go, is that it has been pointed out, and it is pointed out by the Enneagram Masters. They like to call themselves the Enneagram Masters, as though,
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not going to go there.
Did
The
they get a
Enneagram
master's name?
Masters,
Did they get
that
a
it
master's
isn't a
name?
personality profiling tool. It isn't a psychological tool. It is a spiritual tool. And Jay says, yes, but anything can still be scientifically analyzed to see if it's effective for what it does. Jay, what is your conclusion here?
Yeah, so the people who mostly use the Enneagram, so the big names and the people writing the Enneagram books and things like that, they almost none of them have psychology degrees. The only one who does, or at least the bigger names, is Jerome Wagner, and I think Virginia Price may as well. David Daniels was a psychiatrist. So, that sounds like psychology, but it is pretty big different fields. I don't know what any additional training he had in personality psychology, but I say that just to make the point that so they make these claims, and I believe they're genuine, that they are saying that this is a spiritual tool or that it's more than personality, but all the claims of the Enneagram, everything that you get from the description of the types, those are all part of what we consider personality as a personality scientist, and what we kind of look at, the types of variables we would look at, investigate, and test and study when we're doing experiments.
Okay. So before we kind of go into that, because you're going to be doing more work on this, you're working on your doctorate, correct? Still.
Yep.
So you haven't successfully got the phenomenally dumb degree yet, right?
That's right. I did my master's about 10 years ago now. I finished my master's in psychology, and then taught for a while, and then did seminary, and then decided to keep going on with education, and so now I'm in the PhD program.
Okay. Now you just raised an interesting issue, which we should touch on before we go too much farther, because you're analyzing it from a scientific psychological standpoint. You don't have a doctorate, so someone might say, well, what qualifies you to do that? It seems to me, as I read your article, that you had some experience in this field for quite a while before ever running into the Enneagram. What is that?
Yeah, so I was a behavioral scientist in the Air Force for 9 years, and during that time, part of that time, I was teaching psychology and then actually doing my master's degree. So I did a master's degree in psych as well, and a lot of what I did when I was working in more of a traditional job while I was in the Air Force was kind of personnel type of assessment type stuff. Are people right for this job or that job, or how do we evaluate people for jobs and promotions, and so those types of things. And then as I moved on and in my degree now, so I work very closely with my advisor, who does have a PhD and has been working as a psychologist, a research psychologist, for the past 10 years or so, maybe even a little more now. And so these are conversations. It's not just something I've come up with on my own. It's though I got agreement with her on and her assessing my ability to assess the Enneagram, and talking to other psychologists about it as well. And those of at least the few of them who are somewhat knowledgeable about the research on it.
Okay. So that's good. So this is not, you're just not a backyard anti-Enneagram guy. You actually have looked at it from a science standpoint. You have a history in their experience with it, and actually know how to use this because there are scientific tools in the field of psychology. I'm not a big fan of psychology in some areas, and yet there are some areas that are very, very helpful, like psychometrics, which is kind of the area that we're dealing with here. And the reason I brought all this up is because we have dealt primarily with the questions of theology. The Enneagram has a theology, and anyone who thinks it does not is either deceiving themselves or not paying attention to the actual literature by the writers, because they are very clear, starting with Richard Rohr, the resident theologian for the Enneagram, kind of the architect of its theology, let's say, to his disciples, Suzanne Stabile, Ian Cron, Christopher Huertz, have all said it is not about what type of person you are, it is about your path to God. New Agers Russ Hudson also says the same thing. So Having said that, it has a theology. It's not about who you are or why you do what you do. It is about how you deceive yourselves and have created a false identity, according to them. But let's flip the coin here for a second and talk about the question of, is it actually a psychological tool in spite of what they say? And if so, is it a reliable one?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there's a lot going on there, because for some people it's going to be very reliable. It's going to describe them very well, and you get that just if you pick a bunch of random attributes out of a hat, about you are a kind person, or you're thoughtful, or you're mean to people, or whatever it might. You just take this random combination of attributes. It's going to describe some people very well, especially if you use, say, attributes that typically describe everyone. So these are actually known as Barnum statements. And so there's a long history of testing this actually with astrology and trying to figure out why people buy into astrology and why it's so effective. And what they found is basically the statements that come from astrologers or you get in the paper are just very broad general statements that apply to everyone, or what are known as double-barreled statements. So it'll be something along the lines of, you are quiet and reserved persons, but sometimes you really like to go out and enjoy the company of others and party. And so it's like, well, okay, that covers both ends of the spectrum, and it describes pretty much everyone. Some people really well, but some people fairly well. And so you have a lot of these types of statements also embedded in the Enneagram that are just very descriptive of other people. And so that's why it seems to work and it seems accurate. And it is in the sense that it's accurate because it describes everyone, but it's not accurate in the sense that it describes individual people regularly and allows us to make some sort of prediction about their behavior or thoughts or actions in the future. And so that's where it struggles. And then even in the sense of another way we would test or look at reliability is, do people consistently score the same on it over and over? And again, the research shows that if they take the same test more than once, or they're typed in different methods, it just doesn't come out very consistent, which it really suggests that the underlying construct or the claims of the Enneagram just aren't really very descriptive of people.
Either that or nobody has a stable personality, right?
Right. And we do know over time that people's personality changes. And so we would expect some shift. But what makes the Enneagram a little different from what we use as personality scientists is the Enneagram claims that you never change your core type. You're always that your core essence, your type, it never actually changes. And you may take on some characteristics of other types, but the core type never changes. But we know that's not true in lots of research. We know people change extremely drastically over the course of their lifespan, or due to major life events such as, say, a conversion, or maybe birth of a child, or even from a traumatic event.
Okay.
Getting married could cause some changes, could be radical changes for the good or the bad.
Traumatic events.
Yeah.
Divorces. So there's a lot of life circumstances. We have the same thing as we deal with cults and non-Christian religions. Many times people who are in a life-changing situation are susceptible to becoming recruited into a false religious movement because it seems to satisfy some answers in the area of their life where they're in massive flux, let's say, and they don't know how to determine, how do I live now? I've moved to a new geographical area, I have no friends, and this group befriends me or something like that. So how would that fit into this kind of what you're saying is the basic claim of the Enneagram is that your core person doesn't ever change, is the same throughout your life, and yet you can tell by those who have taken the test numerous times that is not true.
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of people are familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality test, or it's sometimes referred to as the MBTI, and that's where you get the four letters, and that's your type. And that kind of has other issues, but specifically in this context of what we're talking about, the idea of typing people, and this is an issue with the Enneagram too, is where most of what we do in psychology and when we're testing people, we score things on a continuum. So you would get a score on something from, say, 1 to 100. That would either be your score on this trait or your percentile or something like that. And we can make predictions based on that level. But if we are just going to arbitrarily say, okay, those scoring from 1 to 50 are, an introvert, and those scoring 51 to 100 are an extrovert, we lose a lot of ability to predict behavior, because someone who scores around 50 is going to probably be a lot different than someone who scores as a 1 or 100. But they're going to be arbitrarily kind of put into one of those categories, and we lose the ability to kind of predict outcomes from that. And most people tend to be in the middle, and when you're in your middle on some sort of trait or attribute, you end up typically shifting a little bit from day to day based on what's going around you. So if you're in the 50th percentile for extroversion, some days you might feel more introverted or be acting more introverted, and then some days you might act more extroverted. And it's not that your personality is ultimately changing, it's just that we all have a degree of flexibility. And if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. If you're an introvert and you can never go out or be around people, that would be extremely handicapping. But when we categorize and stick people into a type, it kind of locks them into that mindset and mentality and the way people treat them, and takes away our ability to kind of predict outcomes based on that.
Okay. So how does it impact, by the way, Mitch Pacwa, Roman Catholic, who is the one who actually, from my understanding, taught the Enneagram to Richard Rohr, later, after doing the test several times himself and realizing, wait, this isn't really working, did the research and realized that it comes from occultism primarily, and wrote a book, Catholics in the New Age, in which he devoted 2 chapters of the book to warn people to stay away from the Enneagram. It is a dangerous spiritual deception. So it's now in the church. I'm estimating between 2 and 4 million evangelicals are involved with the Enneagram. Many seem to think that it's a psychological tool. The Enneagram advocates say it is not a psychological tool. How do we address that then? Either it is or it isn't, or is it a spiritual tool that has implications from a psychologist standpoint, regardless of what it claims?
Yeah, so I guess a couple questions there. One is, how do we address it, but also what is it? I would say it is or can be a spiritual tool, but that's not mutually exclusive from a psychological tool, and so it can be both. And maybe this is a bit of the wrong way to say it, but in the sense that Jesus can be fully man and fully God, right? The Enneagram can be fully spiritual but fully psychological, because again, it's making and it's dependent on claims that we test in the psychological sense. So things that come back, whether it's spiritual, it has to do with the soul and people's ultimate essence of who we are, that has to come out in some way in their worldly actions and how they interact with people in the world, the things they think about, what they do. And so those are the things we're testing. And so as a spiritual tool, it's still 100% and completely testable scientifically in the way that we test any other psychological type of construct, such as IQ or happiness or well-being or anything like that. As far as how do we combat that, time, consistency, trying to put information out there. There's actually some articles with the Barnum statement, and a lot of what they did back starting in the 40s was really the first article to test that from Bertrand Forer, and lots of others have replicated it. They're trying to look at, why do people fall for astrology? And so there's this huge amount of literature on Barnum effect and the Barnum statements, and why people think that they're personally accurate when they're just really kind of general statements about all people. And that research, we kind of solved the problem and said, here's this thing, here's this effect, we know what's going on, and has largely died out since the 80s and 90s, which is kind of rare to happen in the literature, but it's starting to come back, I think, in part because of the Enneagram. But part of what they did and looked at with the astrology stuff is one of the papers, they asked people if they thought astrology was scientifically supported, and those who said it was, that was a very high predictor of whether or not they used it. And so just as simply as letting people know that, sure, it's a spiritual tool, but it does make scientific claims. and we can test those claims, and it just doesn't pan out. And so if it works for you, it may be because coincidence, or it might be that it just seems like it's working better than something when it's really something else might work better, or all kinds of reasons why it might work or seem like it works, but it just doesn't show consistently. When we look at large groups of people, it doesn't consistently work nearly as well as the claims.
Yeah, I have. I wish I had set this up. I have a video that I have used in workshops at times and some of my public speaking that has a group of people in a doctor's office, and all but one has been told that when they hear a certain ding go off, everyone is to stand up momentarily and then sit back down. The new person walks in the room, they don't know what's going on. The ding goes off, everyone stands up, and they kind of look around, they don't exactly know what to do, and then everyone sits down. After about the second or third time, the new person now joins the group. Then they start filtering out the actors as new people come in. And an odd thing happens in almost every case. Within one or two dings of the bell, everybody in the room is standing, until they eventually have everybody out of the room, and the last person in the room by themselves still continues that. There's a lot of peer pressure that goes on to this. How much does that factor into this idea with the Enneagram, especially in churches?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on with that, and I actually love if you sent me the clip, because I've seen that before, and then I think it was from the show Brain Games or something, but I can't remember where I saw it. I never haven't taken the time to look at it again. But yeah, so there's a few things going on there. One is known as the spiral of silence, and so when people talk about things, or they're very excited about it, or speaking very positively, most people don't want to create a ruckus in the group or stand up and say something, and so they'll often sit there and be like, okay, this doesn't describe me, or I see people this causing harm, but everyone else seems so ecstatic about it and happy, so I'm not going to say anything. And so you get this kind of silent group. Sometimes it's minority, but sometimes it may even be the majority, where it just seems like everyone else is using this or happy with it when they're really not. Is also we I guess relates to what we would call the false consensus effect. And I actually teach this when I talk to teens about sex, because a lot of them, a big statement is, a lot of them think that everyone else is having sex, but when they're surveyed privately, they're not. It's actually come down from actually when I was growing up in the 90s, and
really?
It's still not great, but better than it was. And so but what we see is this a huge mismatch where the kids, and we see this effect beyond kids and teenagers. We see it in adults too, but we think everyone else is doing something, or everyone else knows what they're doing or has a positive experience, and so we don't say anything. And that's not the case. And actually, when I was in the Air Force, that was one thing we taught in the Air Force, in the aircraft mishap investigation course. So I taught a few lectures for a course when people, anytime there's an accident, an aircraft accident, they send a team out to investigate what happened and try and figure out what happened, and so we can learn from our mistakes and prevent future errors. And so one of the things we would teach in that is to be aware of this and not just assume that the other person has a completely positive view of something, or if to look for dissent and be willing to speak up at dissent. If you're a leader, especially, look for it, because there are people who disagree that often don't feel comfortable saying it. And so create an atmosphere where people can say it. You can find those things. And since I've started writing against the Enneagram, I've had lots of people come and share stories with me about how it's been harmful for them, or they've seen it harm others, and some that have been really bad.
Well, can we talk about that? I'd like to know more about some of the dangers of the Enneagram.
And so when I first started hearing about it, my wife and I had a few conversations about it, and she actually went to the Women in Apologetics conference and came back. She was on the bus back to her car from the airport, and she overheard a couple other women talking about the Enneagram, because they were just coming back from an Enneagram conference. And one of them was saying on this bus ride back that she has to reevaluate her marriage. And she's not sure she needs to stay with her husband anymore and if they can work out or not. And so she had to figure that out and never know what happened from that or followed up. We don't know how long they've been married. But that was the case. So this was early on when we had first heard about it. We thought, okay, that's an extreme example. That's probably not happening very much, but I'm sure it does. But then come to find, a couple years ago, I wrote an article for Christianity Today on the Enneagram and met someone who actually had a worse experience with the Enneagram, where she had been married for 22 years and her husband got into the Enneagram. And after 22 years, he finally said, our types aren't compatible and we need to get a divorce. And so they got a divorce. They married 22 years with a child. And the Enneagram, they had other problems in their marriage, to be transparent, but he was very clear he said if you want to blame anything, blame the Enneagram, because that was kind of the biggest factor.
Wow. You know, one of the things that you end up with here, along on this topic of danger, is this. In the general conclusion, unless you've done graduate work in psychometrics, the scientific data doesn't mean a whole lot to you, which is why there are two parts to this article. That would apply to me. I don't really understand all the scientific data, although you've done a really good job of explaining it, I think, to the best of my understanding. But you go on and say, for those who have studied psychometrics, it's a no-brainer that the Enneagram simply cannot do all its proponents claim it can. Any scientist who studies personality would simply look at the reliability scores and conclude that the test is not accurate enough to be helpful, and therefore they wouldn't use it because of the potential for harm will be too high. Is this the kind of harm that you're referring to?
Yeah, so this is some of it, and some I've seen and observed or heard about. So certainly is in that way. I've also heard where people were using it in organizations, but then it became a tool to say, okay, well, he only does that because he's this type, or he's this other type, so he won't fit in with the group. And so it leads to some discrimination. So this is both things I've seen or heard about, actual discrimination and essentially from stereotyping. So the same kind of issues we're dealing with in culture right now with race and gender and biological sex, with how we treat men versus women or people of different races, and how that leads to discrimination, wherever people stand on that. Kind of a side point, but we see the same thing with the Enneagram, but it's almost like that's an acceptable way to stereotype and discriminate, because people, I think in most cases, probably think it's true type of stereotyping. And then the other form of harm, which we haven't mentioned, that I've also had people share with me, is how it creates a lot of feelings of self-doubt or low self-worth. And so when people will try to type themselves, they'll read books on it, they'll talk to others, they'll take tests, and they don't come up with the same type consistently, or they can't squarely put themselves in one type or another. And a lot of the resources, the Enneagram resources, will actually have resources specifically for people having trouble typing themselves and how you misidentify yourself. But I've had people say, and tell me when it's not working for them, they really doubted themselves, whether they're being honest with themselves, or maybe there's something wrong with them, that they don't fit into one type, because they've bought into this idea that this is really supposed to describe them and do it accurately. But people just aren't that simple. We don't really fit one of these boxes. And for myself, an example, I would bet, so I've come up with lots of different types on the Enneagram, but and you don't need to know the types to know this, but if I were to rate myself, the most accurate way I would describe myself based on the Enneagram would be a 5 with a 1 wing. But if you know anything about Enneagram, how it's set up, you can't be a 5 with a 1 wing. You can only be a 5 with a 4 wing or a 6 wing. But 4 and 6 are actually probably the ones I'm least like at all. So it makes absolutely no sense that they would be my wings. And knowing psychology and having that background, it doesn't bother me. But I know a lot of people who have had those troubles, who it really causes them a lot of struggle and strife and self-doubt.
I'm not a wingman myself. I go for the dark meat on the chicken. So I have a hard time relating here.
There you have it.
As you can tell, I've never even gone near the Enneagram. I haven't really had much of an interest. I've had some curiosity, but To me, it's just, I don't see much of a difference. I just see it as more of an interactive horoscope uh, with a little fortune cookie thrown in. Um,
I like that. A little interactive horoscope with a touch of a fortune cookie thrown in. Well, it probably comes along at the right time in our church culture. I mean, it was popular in the New Age for quite a number of years. The occultism and the New Age. It wasn't a personality profile system of any kind really until the 1990s,
and
probably.
were you the one, or was somebody else at the conference telling me that it was dying out until
Yeah,
evangelicals picked it up? It was
pretty
kind of
much.
like,
It was dying out, and but then you have this group of um, emergent church types that came in contact with a little known Franciscan friar by the name of Richard Rohr,
okay,
who then helped them and aided and abetted them into progressivism.
yeah,
And along with progressivism, something called contemplative prayer, which became very popular in the early 2000s, and then the Enneagram. So they're all kind of tied together to him. At the same time, you have a culture that wants to be outraged at everything,
yeah, I know.
and we have a sponsor that kind of
It kind
addresses
of
that.
it kind of breaks up the monotony, though, don't you think? Have those boring family dinners become unbearably tedious? Do you wonder when someone will invent a board game that gives your life a real purpose? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself while remaining the center of your universe? Well, then we have just what you're looking for. Puts together all three of these problems. Where's the outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. And where's the outrage? There is no, I can do this. No, unfair. Inequality promoting dice. The rules for taking turns are quite simple. Each player gets points for being in an oppressed group. Then turns are taken in the order of the most points. Next in the game, you choose a bankroller, also known as the game's George Soros. The George Soros distributes the game cards. And now you're ready to play. So each player chooses a game piece, places it in the forward space right there. And the first player to get to go is Briannold, who is an African American, Native American, but non-binary, transgender, former female, whose pronouns are Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Briannold then decides to move to the Christian-owned bakery, where Briannold takes a free lawyer's card. Now Briannold is, and camps out, of course, occupies the space. Then Briannold is free to make another move, goes down to the just visiting part of that awful, nasty free speech zone where Brianna takes an entitlements card, so Brianna can just blow out those fascist white supremacists and their stupid free speech. And now the game is just getting started. The game where the woke shall inherit the earth. Where's the outrage? Of course, as long as you're not a white male. So you need to get this game, Jay. I really think it's plenty of fun for the whole family. It'll give you purpose in your life, at least for a few minutes.
At least for a few minutes, yeah.
So
And
he doesn't look too excited. Okay.
he doesn't know we can actually laugh at some of this stuff, even though it's sweeping. And one of the things that's bothersome to me, Jay, we're missionaries to cults and non-Christian religions. That's really what we're called to do, and what I have spent most of my life on. Periodically, Ron and I and Joy and others have to stop by and go, wait a minute, there's a problem arising in the church, and that probably needs to be addressed, because as we look at Acts 20:28 and following, it says to guard the flock from predators creeping in, right? Wolves in sheep's clothing, if you will.
Yep.
But it also talks about those who rise up from within. In other words, those from among your own ranks who are teaching severe heresy. And so we have found from time to time groups that are doing that. Bill Gothard was one of them that we had to deal with a few years back, and ended up, after 6 years of just trying to bring him into biblical correction, had to write a book on it because he was so resistant to actual correction. It came up with Gwen Shamblin way down workshop, who just by the time someone actually called us and said, has she changed her doctrinal statement, I said, I don't even know who she is, because weight loss programs are not something I'm all that concerned about. I mean, my stock line is when someone asks
and it
how I
shows.
am, I tell them I'm fat but good looking.
Not into weight loss, and it shows.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not into weight loss, and it shows. They told me to watch my waistline, so I got it out there where I could see it very easily. Uh, and so, no, I hadn't heard about her, and checked with a couple of apologetics ministries. And they said, oh, yeah, as far as you know, she's pretty solid. And I looked at her website and said, okay, well, maybe she's just a layperson trying to write on the doctrine of Trinity and deity of Christ and doesn't really understand what she's saying. And I called only just to discover that she meant every word of it, and that the church is a false prophet organization, according to her. She had started her own church, the One True Church, from the Fellowship. She was in 30,000 churches across 60 denominations, had over 1 million had gone through a program in the previous 6 years of being in the church. The Enneagram is doing essentially the same thing to us. It wasn't in the church until 2016. Marcia Montenegro had written on it in 2011. We knew about it, but never expected it to get into the church. Frankly, because it seemed to be mystical Roman Catholic thing primarily. And yet evangelicals are racing to this because InterVarsity Press, for example, is selling it as a ancient spiritual tool. It is not. So there's a lot wrong with it theologically. But back to you, and you said that the potential for harm would be too high for those who use it, and so professionals would not use it. Why, oh, why are people using it?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think there's a lot of reasons why people are using it. So it's hard to say, okay, people use it for this one reason. I think for the most part, the people who are using it are doing it with good intentions. They hear that someone had a success with it and it's helped them in their relationships or it's helped them grow personally. They read the descriptions, they read some of the type descriptions, and it seems to be accurate of them. Sometimes I'll hear the phrase eerily accurate, which when I teach on the use of personality in ministry and specifically apologetics, I'll give a kind of fake personality test as a fun little game, because one of the lessons I teach is kind of how we can use psychology for apologetics. And so I give this personality test, and then I basically play brain games with them the whole time, and it's fun and we learn. But in this one activity specifically, I'll give them a fake personality test, and then I'll give them the results. And the results will be kind of composed of these Barnum statements that we've already talked about. And I'll have them rate each individual statement. And one of the options is the statement is eerily accurate. And I get a lot of people who say that with multiple statements there. So pretty much everyone will say at least one of the statements, if not more, is eerily accurate. And so it gives them the chills, like, oh, how did they know I think like this or act like this? So when you read a statement like that, it's hard to say no, that's not an accurate test when this test has these types of statements, especially once you find your type and you go, oh, there's 2 or 3 of these eerily accurate statements. And so once people have heard positive things about it and their own experience, they read it and it seems to describe them, they have no reason to think otherwise. Most people aren't going to stop and think, okay, well, what are the psychometrics of this, or how would a psychologist or scientist evaluate this to see if it's accurate? They know it's accurate because they've seen it and watched it, that they've done it themselves. And as much as in our difficult world, we never know who or what to trust, we all feel like we can trust ourselves. And so
now you hit on now you hit on something I think is a really important point in this whole discussion, because it is a self-validating test. It's not quite like one where you actually have to pay a fairly good size amount of money that is set up in such a way to where it's not impossible, pretty close to impossible to fool the test, because they ask the same question maybe 30 different ways as you go through it. In this case, it's self-validating. Are we, any of us, really honest understanders and truthful describers of ourselves in these kind of tests?
Yeah, so there's actually research on this to see how we rate ourselves versus how we are rated by others and that comparison. And what tends to be the case is we are typically better at rating ourselves when it comes to things that are more internal. So our thoughts or motives or intents behind our actions. But when it's more external type things, so how we act and behave, so like extroversion is, how often you or how you kind of get energized by being out with other people or being alone. Other people tend to be a little more accurate in rating us on those. And so we can do both pretty well. And we know they're accurate based on what better predicts outcomes. So can I better predict if you're going to keep your room clean, if you're going to go to a party, what profession you're in, those types of things. And so the better prediction typically comes, we're a little better at predicting or rating ourselves internally. Other people who are close to us tend to be a little better at those external things. But in either case, we are still pretty good at it. And that's why those tests, we ask questions, similar questions in different ways to kind of get a full picture, because that helps eliminate some of that error in the way that we respond based on whether it's just mood, the way we read the question, how we're feeling if we are trying to fool ourselves. And so we do that with our tests, and there are a lot of good tests. You can take a Big Five or Hexaco test. You can usually find free versions of that online. And so, yeah, I would say typically we are pretty good at rating ourselves in those things. But the issue comes with the Enneagram is that you take this test and you've rated yourself, probably done it accurately based on the questions, but then the results of the test go far beyond what they asked in those questions or what would be kind of the logical outflow from those questions. And they start to stray into other areas.
Okay, so Corky asked the question, could this also be used to control others by manipulating them through how they are told to see themselves?
Yeah, so I think it probably could, but it would be very difficult and laborious to do. But essentially what happens when someone takes an Enneagram or any test, so we have, I guess as psychologists, we have a term called self-fulfilling prophecy. And so when you're treated a certain way or you think you are a certain way, you start to act and become that way. And so the Enneagram, what it can do is if you find out your type, and the point of the types, as many of the Enneagram teachers will tell you, is that you can essentially become beyond that type and transcend beyond it, in the sense that you don't have any of the weaknesses and you only have the strengths, and you can take on other types. And so the intent of it, as they say, is actually good, what they're trying to do, but in reality and how we work as people and what we know through lots of scientific research is the opposite is usually the case, where it becomes more of like a self-confirming kind of thing, and it becomes something that now sticks, okay, I'm this type, and so I tend to act this way, and it's not a conscious thing process. And so we're more likely probably in most cases to become more like our types and take on even the negative aspects of our type, even if we didn't have those things before. And so if you can do that, you can get people to buy in to their type and fully accept it, then that allows you opportunities to kind of treat them in ways or manipulate them in ways in which that can be used to your advantage, or even to excuse your behavior, so that people are less likely to call you out on it. So, for instance, the one that often comes up is type 8s. They're kind of like the challenger or like the leader type. And so people may say, okay, well, I'm a type 8. This is just who I am. And people who so if they're being aggressive or hostile, so kind of like maybe like Mark Driscoll and some of the issues with Mark Driscoll and how he would, has yelled at people, part of his staff, and was really aggressive toward them, those types of things. Well, if I'm a type 8 and you're in my organization and we use the Enneagram, I can now get you to buy into that. Okay, that's just what type 8s do. And so I need to accept that and be willing to be okay with it. And it gives me a free pass on doing things that are illegal or borderline illegal.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me years ago that one of the popular personality profiling ones years ago, which wasn't considered a spiritual tool, it's just a corporate tool, kind of like you're talking about with trying to decide who's going to work where. the DISC profile, DISC. And the senior pastor of our church said, well, I'm a high D. That is just how I am. I'm a dominant, and you just have to live with it because I'm not going to change that. It's just my personality. And I didn't really buy into that, which created some issues from time to time. So eventually, when they got to the point of having elders, and I was nominated to be an elder by the majority of the church, and he managed to come out and say, no, under no circumstances can Don be an elder because we don't get along well enough. So it can be manipulative, as you point out, if you use it as an excuse for bad behavior. Okay. We have pastors that take the Enneagram and use it as a 9-week sermon series. We have churches that are taking the Enneagram and using it for marriage groups. We have churches that are taking the Enneagram and using it for, quote, discipleship, end quote. Is it a biblically centered tool that you can use it for anything like any of those uses?
So I guess there's my approach to that would be, if it's accurate, if it really describes people, if this is something that just happened to come out of the new age, but it really is an accurate, reliable descriptor of people, then it should be flexible enough to be used in those different things, because as Christians, we love the truth and we believe what is true. And so if that were the case, I would say, yeah, it just happens to be that it came from these sketchy backgrounds or practices. But with the Enneagram, it's not the case that it's accurate. It makes a lot of false claims and things that says things that aren't true about people, or at least the majority of people. And so because it's false, that means that it can't really be used well for those purposes, because it's going to lead people to believe false things if they use it. And bigger than that, what's going to happen is it's going to cause people to use the Enneagram rather than better tools. So if I give you the option of 2 tools for spiritual growth and you choose the less effective one, maybe you grow a little bit, maybe you don't, maybe you even have harm, I don't know, but using that one, that has taken time and effort and energy away from using the one that we know is going to be effective and more effective, and is really going to improve your relationships with other people and with God, and your ability to interact with other people in the world, or whatever it might be. And that's another, I guess, issue with the Enneagram that isn't very much talked about, when people often rely on, fall back on, well, it worked for me. It's like, okay, well, maybe it did, sure, but something else would have worked better, or will work better en masse for lots of people. And so when you keep pushing the Enneagram as the thing that will solve everyone's problems, you're preventing them from using something better that would be more accurate. And therefore, something more accurate is going to be more biblical as people who love the truth.
Right. Well, and Ron is a biblical counselor. He has this, this kind of weird, antiquated idea that sola scriptura is all you need for faith and practice. That doesn't mean there aren't other things out there that can be helpful to come alongside of it, but they have to be vetted really through what does Scripture teach. Mm-hmm. I've had quite a few that I've had to deal with who've left cults. My dealings with them usually focus on what does the Bible say about whatever the issue is that they're calling me about, and they'll quote a Bible verse on having to do with their behavior, and so we'll go, okay, well, let's read it in context and see if it's even talking about what you're using it for. Now, here's how that bears into my next question. Because it seems to me that the Enneagram is working so hard to be the be-all, end-all. I mean, it is. I've been reading Jeremiah in my devotionals, and it's interesting how Jeremiah is, through satire and such, telling Israel, God is saying, I don't really understand what you're doing. You go to a tree, you carve it out, and you say, you are my father. Isn't that what the Enneagram is doing in many, many ways? You have a picture that they say is the face and body of God. Is that a new idol that is now going to get you closer to God if you just become Enneagram proficient?
Yeah, that's hard to know because I hear it talked about that way, but I don't know. I've actually talked to anyone who uses that way, in that sense. But it's where I would see it as an idol is the amount of time that people put into it, and they will, read books on it or articles or listen to podcasts, and they will spend several hours a week doing it, and they're applying it to other people, and they're journaling about it and how they've overcome issues with their type, and so it becomes an idol in the sense that it is what's taking their time and money, attention away from, say, prayer. Although I'm assuming a lot of people use the Enneagram in prayer to say, like, hey, this is who I am, and God, please help me with this, which I don't know if that would be a good or bad use of it, but it's still taking them time away from them, essentially more focused on other people. And that would be where I would say the bigger problem is that when we have this hyper kind of focus on ourselves for self-awareness, even if it's for good purpose, even if it's to grow, we're going to have probably more negative effects from that than positive effects. And we see that, and that's part of the literature on self-awareness, is that focusing too much on it is not positive. It is detrimental, and we don't experience the growth that we should when we focus too much on self-awareness. It's kind of like, I think it is C.S. Lewis who says, in Mere Christianity, if you seek for happiness, you'll never attain it. You seek other things, they bring happiness as a result. And so it's the same with this self-awareness. If you're just seeking self-awareness through self-awareness, you're not really attaining it and you're not growing. But if you go out and you serve others and you are part of a community and you're interacting and engaging with other people and you're out doing those types of things that are going to lead to spiritual growth more traditionally, that's going to help you even more, and it's actually going to teach you more about yourself in the process.
That is very well said. And actually it's something we have taught on a lot. When I speak in churches, one of the things I try to do if I'm afforded the opportunity to speak multiple times is I usually will start out with the discussion on the role of the pastor. And my point there is that the pastor's task, he's only has two jobs really, but his attitude is he's a servant. And so it's bottom-up leadership. He serves and others follow. It's shepherding rather than cattle herding, where you're getting behind and forcing people in a certain direction. He's walking along and they're following him. That's how it works. He's serving the body. His task is to protect the body and to train the body. That's his two jobs, really, biblically. And as he serves, others begin serving. As they serve, they grow spiritually. And as you point out, that's kind of where you derive your fulfillment, your happiness, is really in serving others. It's not in figuring out who I am. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, I would say, yeah. And, we hear about people going on the journey to find themselves or taking a gap year or whatever, which I would say that in theory, there's nothing wrong with that. But what they're often doing is they're having experiences. They're trying new foods, they're meeting new people, they're exploring different cultures. Well, when you sit around and read books on the Enneagram or listen to podcasts or just examine evaluate other people's personality based on the Enneagram, you're not getting the exposure to that. If you want to really get the exposure to that, go and serve people in your community, especially people who are less fortunate than you, or go to the not so nice neighborhoods, or go on a mission trip, or spend time serving in your children's ministry at your church, because we know they need the help, and that's going to teach you a lot more patience probably than anything else you can do. So there's lots of those things you can do. You can find out, am I a patient person, or am I not? Do I like this or do I like that thing? And you'll find that more out if you are gaining those experiences and doing it with a biblical framework.
Right. Okay. What are you now? You're working on your doctorate. You have said you're going to do more work on the Enneagram as this develops. What do you foresee yourself doing as terms of evaluating and potentially exposing problems in the Enneagram?
So I'm working on right now. I kind of have, I guess you would say, like an early draft ready of an article, like a scientific review article on the Enneagram. So I'm working on just kind of finishing that up. And that kind of looks at all the literature that's been published on the Enneagram that's actually tested it scientifically, and all done except one article. All of it's been done by people who are advocates of the Enneagram, and I can know that based on their hypothesis. So the people, they're all hypothesizing that people will they'll get certain results that match Enneagram theory or ideas. Only one article made hypothesis that it would not match what the Enneagram claims. And this is out of probably between journal articles and dissertation projects, probably about 150 different empirical investigations of the Enneagram. So I've kind of categorized and gone through all of that literature, and I want to actually add a meta-analysis where I look at basically combine the results from all the studies and do a statistical analysis on that to test some new ideas that haven't been tested on the Enneagram. And so working on that, hope to get that done by the end of the year, possibly a book on it, but that's kind of little uncertain right now, and then doing some data collection on it right now as well to maybe publish something that may not focus specifically on the Enneagram. It might be more personality broadly, but there'll be kind of new aspects of it and some new tests on the Enneagram and whether or not it's reliable, testing the types in a different way that haven't been tested before.
Have you gotten much pushback from evangelicals or anybody else, but I'm mostly concerned with evangelicals?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of pushback from a couple of them who have used it. I was actually exposed to it initially by evangelicals, or I guess you would say evangelicals who are using it. So it does tend to be something that oddly is something that is used by both like evangelicals and more progressive or liberal Christians. And I was actually on a podcast last week, a more progressive one. Progressive podcast talking about it. And so it is one of those weird things that does kind of span a large group of Christians.
Would you go as far as to say that if you see an Enneagram score in somebody's Twitter bio, that's a predictor that they are at least leaning progressive or pushing the edge theologically?
I would say probably, but I would say it's probably not a very good one. So when we build our models scientifically, what we're doing is, and we say something predicts something else. So in this case, Enneagram number in their bio predicts their liberalness or progressiveness, right? I would say that might be something that would maybe be maybe only 10% accurate. And so it predicts part of the time. And so if we combine that with a lot of other variables, then maybe we'd be able to predict at a rate a little more successful than chance.
I see connections to evangelicals who promote critical race theory. Again, I have no scientific proof or evidence. I'm just telling you my anecdotal experience. But if you're if you're into, affirming, if not LGBT, at least side B gay Christianity, good chance I'm going to see your Enneagram score in there. That's been my experience. It'd be interesting to see. I can throw a few variables your way that I'd like to see tested. How's that?
Yeah, and that would be interesting. That would be something that might possibly be pretty easy to get the data on from Twitter and write an article on to see.
Yeah, and we've kind of observed something like that with critical race theory and the Enneagram. It's anecdotal, obviously, but several institutions that we've been contacted about, Christian schools, for example, and some churches that either were contacted because they're steeped in critical race theory, and after doing some discussion and trying to sort out how do we handle this, discover that they are also fully on board with the Enneagram, and vice versa. Now, they're not connected directly, which was odd to me, because the Enneagram is one thing, critical race theory is something else.
Right.
And yet it seems like the common denominator is some thread of progressivism that sort of embraces these things.
I'm not sure exactly why there's this connection, but yeah, that's a good possibility.
Yeah, and I've seen connections maybe in other ways with other things, and I don't know if it applies to this, but what I've noticed sometimes is sometimes an underlying connection with different things that aren't otherwise connected is the way that people think and what they consider as reliable evidence for something, and if they're more apt to take personal experience as evidence versus not, or more trusting of science. And there's a lot of variables and factors that go to that, which may or may not be the case here with the Enneagram, but it's something I've considered and wanted to do research on, but it is on the back burner for now. But I will say that I was at a debate. My advisor was actually debating the Enneagram in a local church situation here, and one of the people who was using it within the church, and she had said, actually one of her African American students came up to her and said, this is not a black person thing, we don't do this. And so that really caused her a lot of trouble, because she is very tries to be very inclusive racially, and yet she had this black student telling her the Enneagram is not something that they do in their culture, and it's a white thing basically. And so she had some struggle with that, and I don't know to what degree that's a thing, because there is a book on the Enneagram and race by, I think, a black woman. I forget what it's called. It's Black Liberation and the Enneagram or something like that it's called. So I don't know if that's to what degree it is a white thing or not, because I do know it's used in say other cultures. Some of the articles on it have been in Korean or Iranian or Turkey. So it's not exclusively a white American Christian thing.
Okay. Well, Jay, we have your website in the description panel. People can go there. They can read your articles. And you are working on a project and had said if you have how do you want to phrase this? You're trying to figure out how this has harmed people.
Yeah.
How
So I
would they
think
contact you to let you know of their stories for your consideration?
they can reach out to me on social media or through my website on the contact me page and just shoot me a message. And so anything harm related, so whether it's caused and not even if it's necessarily bad, so if two people break up and it turns out to be that, hey, they should have broken up, but the Enneagram was kind of the catalyst for that. I'm just interested in collecting some of those stories to see and get maybe an idea of how frequent they are, or to what the range of types of situations those are, because we only hear often about the good and the people who are using it, and we don't always hear about even if people who are using it and like it, where they do see it used as a discrimination tool, or it does cause strife in people's life. And so I'm interested in collecting some data on that, just to get a better feel for how how it does cause some harm for people.
Yeah, it is. Even Marcia Montenegro and I were trying to help a couple. The husband was an associate pastor at a church, and because he was in disagreement with the usage of the Enneagram, he was invited to leave the church, and he had been there for years. So it was pretty devastating to him to do that. So
I'll bet.
all right. Jay, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us, and I know this will be helpful for some. Again, our Enneagram conference is online beginning Monday at 7. If you go to the website enneagramsecret.com, click on the link to the program page. You don't even have to sign up. You just go down, see what the sessions are, pick which stream you want to use, because it's coming through 5 different streaming locations, and you can dial in at 7 o'clock on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And Friday evening we also have a live Q&A. So send us questions, because we want to try to field as many questions as we can.
That's next week, right, Tom?
That's next week, beginning on Monday. Ron, would you care to walk us out of here?
Yes, let's give credit to whom and to where credit is due. I am trying to press this button. There's something that's going goofy here on my Here we go. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Holly Gummas. Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yolene Pullen. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisoni. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happen. All right, Jay, now you can join us in our royal wave as we depart